The mountain had no mercy that winter, and neither did the people who lived inside it. The snow came down sideways across the Carpathians the night Mara Vlaz was sent into the chapel alone, a single tallow candle in her cracked hands and a rag tucked into the rope at her waist. She was 19 years old. She had not heard her own name spoken aloud in 3 years. They called her Ashhand. They called her Girl. They called her Eclipseborn when they were drunk and feeling cruel. The chapel doors were taller than 3 men and bound in iron the color of dried blood, and the housekeeper smiled when she pushed Mara through them and said, "Polish the floor until I can see the moon in it." The doors closed. Mara was alone with the coffin. And from inside the black iron, through gold runes older than the kingdom, a voice she had never heard in her life whispered one word, Mara. She had been sold to the castle on a frozen Tuesday in the autumn of her 16th year, and the price had been 4 copper coins and a sack of milled rye. Her own father had counted the coins twice. The village priest had crossed himself when Mara walked past him, because Mara had been born during an eclipse, and an eclipse-born child, the old women said, carried a hole in her soul through which the dark wind blew. She had grown up with that hole. She had grown up sleeping in the goat shed because no roof would have her. She had grown up answering to every name except her own, because to speak the name of the cursed was to invite the curse, and the village had been very careful not to invite anything at all. When the wagon from the mountain castle had rolled into the square asking for cheap girls who would not be missed, her father had pointed at her without standing up. Mara had not cried. Mara had not packed. She had nothing to pack. She had climbed into the wagon and watched the only road she had ever known shrink into the white. The driver had not asked her name. He had asked only whether she could lift a bucket. She could lift a bucket. That was the whole interview. The castle had swallowed her like a wolf swallows a sparrow. There were 97 servants in the lower halls and 4 ranks of them, and Mara was placed at the bottom of the bottom, the rank with no name, the rank that emptied the chamber pots and the ash pans, and scrubbed the stone floors on hands and knees from the 3rd bell before dawn until the 2nd bell of the next night. 18 hours a day. Sometimes 20. She slept on a straw pallet in the corridor outside the kitchen, where the heat from the ovens kept her from freezing, and the noise from the cooks kept her from dreaming. She was beaten when she slowed. She was beaten when she spilled. She was beaten when the head housekeeper, a square-shouldered woman named Vasilia who hated all things small and quiet, simply felt like reminding the rest of the staff what the bottom of the rope looked like. Mara learned to fold her body around the blows. She learned to keep her eyes on the floor. She learned, most of all, to be no one. There were 3 older servants who tried, in their small and frightened ways, to keep her alive. Old Berta, who oversaw the linens, slipped her a heel of bread on nights when the kitchen had counted wrong. Cook Tomas, who had lost a daughter to the cold winter of 41, sometimes pretended not to see Mara warming her hands at his fire. And lame Petru, the stable boy who was almost 40 and had been called a boy his whole life, taught her without ever speaking which corridors the regent's men preferred, so she could be in the others. None of them used her name either. They were too afraid. To name the Eclipseborn was to mark yourself beside her, and Vasilia's hand was heavy, and the regent's hand was heavier. So Mara existed inside a silence that was almost a tomb. She brushed past her own reflection in dark windows and did not recognize the girl she saw. The girl she saw had no name. The girl she saw was a shadow with a rag. The castle itself was a place of rumors and locked doors. It sat on a black peak in the eastern Carpathians, 3 days' ride from any town, ringed by pine forests so old and so dense that even the wolves preferred to skirt them. The wind sang through its arrow slits at night in a key that sounded like grief. The fog never fully lifted. Inside, the halls were lit by a single candle every 20 paces, and the shadows between those candles were heavy enough to hide a man, which they often did. The court was ruled by the regent, Lord Coffin Sanguine, who was 81 years old and had the cold eyes of a thing that had eaten too much for too long. He was the nephew of the true king. The true king, everyone whispered when no one was listening, was asleep. The true king had been asleep for 47 years. The true king was Eligius Sanguine, 312 years old, last of the old blood, and he slept in a coffin of black iron sealed with gold runes in the locked chapel at the heart of the keep. The regent kept him sleeping. The council kept him sleeping. The court kept him sleeping. And no servant, on pain of being walled into the western tower, was ever to enter that chapel without the regent's seal. Vasilia hated Mara more than she hated anyone, because Mara did not break. Vasilia had broken many girls in her time. She had broken them with words and with sticks, and with cold rooms and with hunger. Mara would bleed when struck and she would weep when alone, but she would not break, and Vasilia could feel the unbroken thing inside the girl the way a dog feels another dog through a fence. It enraged her. It made her thoughtful in the way cruel people are thoughtful, slow, patient planning. And so, on the night of the heaviest snow of that winter, when half the staff was sick, and the chapel floor had not been scrubbed in 2 weeks because no one wanted to go near the coffin, Vasilia found Mara in the corridor and pressed a single candle into her hand and said, "You will polish the chapel floor tonight. You will polish it until I can see the moon in it. And do not worry, girl, the king sleeps. He has slept for 47 years. He will not mind your company." Mara understood, the way mice understand traps, that she was being sent to her death. If she touched the coffin, even by accident, the regent's men would wall her into the tower. If she did not finish the floor, Vasilia would beat her until her ribs cracked. She bowed her head. She took the candle. She walked the long, cold corridor to the chapel doors with the rag tucked into her rope belt, and her heart making a sound she had not heard it make before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of listening. As if her heart had heard something her ears had not yet caught. The iron doors were unlocked. Vasilia stood behind her, smiling that thoughtful, slow, planning smile. Mara stepped through. The doors closed behind her, with a sound like a stone being rolled across a grave. The chapel was a long, narrow room with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, 6 tall windows of black glass, and a single raised dais at the far end. On the dais lay the coffin. It was longer than a tall man and made of iron so black it ate the candlelight, and across its lid the gold runes moved very slightly, the way water moves under thin ice. Mara did not look at it. Mara had decided, on the way down the corridor, that she would not look at it. She would scrub the floor in a spiral starting at the doors and moving inward, and she would scrub past the dais without raising her eyes, and she would scrub her way back out, and she would never tell anyone where she had been. She set her candle in a chipped iron holder by the door. She knelt. She wet her rag in the bucket. She began. The stone was cold enough to burn her knees through her skirt. The chapel smelled of old incense and something sweeter underneath, like apples kept too long in a cellar. Her breath made small white clouds in the candlelight. She scrubbed. She scrubbed. The spiral closed in on the dais, slow as a clock. She kept her eyes on the rag. She kept her mind on nothing. And then, with the coffin 3 feet from her shoulder and the rag making its slow wet circle, her sleeve, frayed at the cuff, too long because the dress had belonged to a taller girl who had died of fever last spring, her sleeve brushed the cold iron side of the black coffin. Just once. Just a whisper of wool against metal. And the metal whispered back. Mara. She did not move. She did not breathe. The word had not come through the air. The word had come through the iron, into her sleeve, into her arm, into the small bones behind her ear. It was a man's voice, very quiet, very old, very tired. It was a voice that had not used itself in a long time. It said her name, the way a person says the name of someone they have been waiting for. And then it was gone, and there was only the chapel, and the candle, and the cold, and her own heart hitting the inside of her ribs like a fist on a door. She did not scream. Screaming would bring Vasilia, and Vasilia would bring the regent's men, and the men would wall her into the tower for being near the coffin. So she did the only thing a girl with no name and no roof can do. She finished the floor. She made her spiral all the way back to the doors. She wrung out her rag. She picked up her candle. She walked out of the chapel with her face as empty as the snow, and when Vasilia inspected the floor and could in fact see a smear of moon on it, Vasilia grunted and let her go to bed without a beating. Mara lay on her straw pallet that night with her hand pressed over her own mouth, because if she did not press, she was afraid the word might come out of her, and if the word came out of her, she did not know what would answer. She returned the next night. Vasilia, surprised and pleased to have found a chore the eclipse-born would do without weeping, sent her back. And the next, and the next. 6 nights in a row Mara polished the chapel floor, and 6 nights in a row the coffin whispered her name once, only once, somewhere in the middle of her spiral, when her body was close enough for the iron to recognize her again. It was always the same Mara, and it was always a question and an answer at once, as if the voice were checking that she was still there and being grateful. She told no one. She could tell no one. She would have been killed for being in that clothes. So she carried the word inside her chest like a hot coal carried inside a clay pot, and at night she lay on her pallet and she said her own name in her own head over and over, because someone in the world had finally said it back to her, even if that someone was a king sealed in iron, even if the saying might kill her. On the 7th night, when her rag had reached the closest point of the spiral, and her sleeve was almost touching the cold black side, the voice did not say only Mara. The voice said, Mara Vlas of Bistra. And Mara dropped the rag, because no one in the castle knew the name of her village. She had never spoken it. It had not been written on the bill of sale, which had only listed a girl age 16, no defect. The driver had not asked. Vasilia had not asked. Bistra was a stain on a map 3 days behind her, and a man who had not breathed in 47 years should not have known that stain existed. And yet through the iron, the king of the mountain had named her place. He had named her people. He had named the eclipse and the goat shed and the 4 copper coins. He had named with 2 syllables and a place the whole shape of the hole in her life. She backed away from the coffin. She picked up the rag with shaking hands. She finished the floor by candlelight that flickered with her breathing. She walked out of the chapel that night different from the girl who had walked in, though she did not yet know in what way, and Vasilia, watching her come down the corridor, narrowed her eyes. Vasilia did not like the calm she saw on the eclipse-born's face. Calm, in Vasilia's experience, was something only the dangerous and the dead wore well. She struck Mara hard across the cheek without warning and said, "You will not enter that chapel again. The council comes next week. The regent does not want ash hands near the king. Do you understand me, girl?" Mara, with the print of Vasilia's palm blooming on her face, said yes, ma'am, and bowed her head and went to bed, and did not enter the chapel the next night, or the night after that, or the night after that. For 3 nights she did not go. And the king, sealed in his black iron in the cold, dark chapel, did not whisper to anyone at all. She thought she could live with the silence. She had lived with silence her whole life. The hot coal in her chest cooled. The word Mara, said in a man's tired voice, began to feel like something she had dreamed during a fever, and Mara knew about fever dreams, and she knew the trick of not believing in them once the fever passed. She returned to the ashpans and the chamber pots and the cold floors of the lower halls. She kept her eyes down. She folded her body around the blows. The castle prepared for the council. The kitchens roared. The wine cellars opened. The regent walked the corridors in his black wolf fur cloak and inspected his own portrait in every hall, and Vasilia hovered behind him like a square-shouldered shadow, and Mara polished and emptied and carried and was no one again, and almost was relieved. On the 10th night since the king had last whispered her name, the regent held his annual feast. Every noble of the eastern range came. The Council of Six came. They sat at a long oak table beneath 100 candles in iron rings, and the hall smelled of roasted boar and pine smoke, and red wine so dark it looked black in the cups. Servants flowed between the chairs like water around stones. Vasilia, short on hands because of the winter fevers, was forced to use Mara. She put Mara in a clean gray dress and warned her, with a hand on the back of Mara's neck, that one drop spilled would end her. Mara understood. Mara carried wine for 2 hours without spilling. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes stayed on the rims of the cups. She was, again, no one, and being no one, she did not see the regent's elbow when he turned to laugh at one of the council's jokes. His elbow struck the pitcher. Wine, dark as the windows of the chapel, soaked the front of his white silk robe. A small silence opened in the hall. Every face turned. Vasilia's mouth made a small round shape of fury. The regent rose from his chair very slowly. He looked down at his ruined robe, and then he looked at Mara, and his eyes were the eyes of a thing that had eaten too much for too long, and his hand came up. Mara did not move. She did not duck. There was no point. She had been struck 1,000 times in 3 years, and she would be struck once more, and perhaps this one would finish it, and perhaps that was a mercy. She closed her eyes. She thought of Bistra. She thought of the eclipse. She thought of the goat-shed roof seen from underneath in the dark. She thought of the word Mara said through cold iron. And then every candle in the hall went out. Every single one. 100 flames, in iron rings around the walls and in tall sticks down the table and in sconces above the doors, snuffed in a single breath, as if a great cold mouth had bent down over the castle and blown. The hall fell into a dark so complete that for one long heartbeat no one moved, no one spoke, no one breathed. The regent's hand froze midair an inch from Mara's cheek. She felt the heat of his palm. She felt the heat go cold. Somewhere very far away, at the back of the keep, a sound began that none of them had heard in 47 years. The sound of the chapel doors being opened from the inside. A single footstep echoed in the corridor. Then another. Then another. They were slow and they were not in a hurry, because the man making them had not used his feet in a long time and was relearning their weight. The court sat in the dark and listened to those footsteps approach the feast hall. Vasilia made a small whimpering sound that Mara had never heard her make before. The regent's hand, still raised, began to tremble. A noble dropped a goblet. It did not shatter. The dark was thick enough to catch it. The footsteps reached the doors of the hall. The doors swung inward without being touched. And then he was there. Eligius Sanguine, 312 years old, walked into his own court for the first time in 47 years. He was tall and gaunt, and his cheekbones cut shadows under his eyes. His skin was the color of candle wax. His hair was long and black and brushed with dust from the chapel air. He still wore the clothes they had buried him sleeping in, a long coat of midnight velvet, silver buttons gone tarnished, a high collar embroidered with the gold runes that had also been written on his coffin. His eyes, when they opened fully, were the color of old wine held to a candle. The candles, as if reminded of their duty, came back to life one by one along the walls behind him. Not all at once. In sequence. A slow ripple of light following his shoulder as he passed. He walked the length of the feast hall. He did not look at the regent. He did not look at the council. He did not look at the nobles who fell to their knees in pairs as he passed them, like wheat going down before a slow wind. He walked to Mara. He stopped in front of her. The regent's hand was still raised. Eligius did not even acknowledge it. He looked down at Mara, at the print of Vassilia's palm still warm on her cheek, at the gray dress, at her bare feet on the cold flagstones, at her bowed head, and he reached out, with a hand that had not held a living thing in 47 years, and he took her hand in his. His fingers were cold. They were not the cold of death. They were the cold of a stone that had been waiting in a deep place for the sun. He turned to his court. His voice, when he used it for the room and not for the iron, was low and quiet and carried into every shadow. He said, "She is the queen I have waited for. 3 centuries. 47 years. Hold no hand against her. Speak no word above her. She is mine and she is yours, and she is the answer to the prophecy of my line." The regent collapsed to his knees. He did not fall exactly. His knees simply ceased to be his. He pressed his forehead to the flagstones of the hall. He had ruled for 47 years, and he did not look up. Vassilia had already gone to the floor. The council bent like reeds. And Mara, with the king's cold fingers wrapped around hers and her own name, Mara Vlas of Bistra, echoing through the hall in a voice no longer trapped in iron, lifted her face for the first time in 3 years and looked at the room that had owned her. The hall did not move for a long time. Eligius did not let go of Mara's hand. The candles burned steady. Outside, the snow kept falling, but the wind through the arrow slits had stopped its grieving. The keening note of 47 years had simply closed, the way a long song closes on a held breath. The king turned, very slowly, and looked at last at his nephew. He looked at the regent the way a man looks at a clock that has been keeping the wrong hour for half his life. He said, "Rise, Coffin." The regent could not rise. Eligius said it again, gentler. Coffin sanguine rose, trembling, and his black wolf fur cloak hung on him now like a coat on a scarecrow. For 7 days the castle held its breath. The council was called. The lower servants, who had heard the story from the upper servants, who had heard it from the understewards, who had heard it from the wine boys who had been in the hall, treated Mara with a fear so wide it took her 3 days to recognize it as something other than the old fear they used to carry near her. Eligius did not let her sleep in the corridor again. He gave her a room with a window. He sent Berta and Tomas and lame Petru to attend her, and he asked her, on the 2nd day, what should be done with his nephew. He had been preparing, she could see, to put Coffin to a slow and traditional death, a death the old blood remembered, a death involving iron and dawn. Mara, who had spent 3 years learning to fold her body around blows, looked at the king and said, "No." He bowed his head and waited. She said, "Banish him. Send him down the mountain in the clothes he wears. Let the road be his judge." Eligius considered this for a long, quiet moment, and then he smiled for the first time in 47 years, and he said, "Your first decree, Queen. So it is done." And that was how it went. The regent was put on a mule at the foot of the keep in his black wolf fur cloak, and was watched until the fog took him. The council was reformed. Vassilia, whom Mara could have walled into the tower with a single nod, was sent instead to the kitchens to peel turnips under the eye of cook Tomas, who treated her with a careful, unsmiling fairness that broke her more thoroughly than any whip. Eligius held court in the throne room beneath the painted ceiling of stars no one had cleaned in half a century, and he explained, to the lords who could still listen, that Mara's birth during the eclipse had never been a curse. The old blood of his line had been waiting 300 years for an eclipse-born daughter of the eastern range. The mark her village had hated her for was the mark his coffin had been listening for. He had recognized her, he said, the way a lock recognizes its key, not by sight, because he had not yet seen her, but by the song her blood made walking past iron. He had whispered her name through the runes, because the runes were the only mouth he had. He had waited until she could bear to hear it. And on the seventh night, when she could, he had named her place, because the prophecy required that she know herself before he could rise to her. The hall was silent when he finished. The hall Mara saw believed him, or believed enough of him to bow. 1 year passed. The mountain still had no mercy for its weather. The snow still came down sideways through the pines in winter, and the fog still hung low and gray over the keep in summer, and the wolves still skirted the old forest, and the wind still found the arrow slits. But inside the castle, a kind of thaw had taken hold that no calendar could explain. Mara, 20 years old now, queen of the eastern range, walked the corridors at her own pace and in her own shoes. She had cut her hair short to her shoulders, because she liked the weight of it gone. She wore gray and silver, and sometimes deep red, never white. She kept Berta as her chief of household, and Berta had, in her old quiet way, rewritten the rules of the lower halls 12-hour shifts instead of 18, a hot meal at each one, a half-day of rest every 7th day, a strict and public ban on the striking of any servant by any hand. The girls who had been Girl and Ashhand and Eclipseborn were now Annika and Doina and Sara and Lenka, and the older servants spoke their names without flinching, because the king had spoken his queen's name in the feast hall and the air had not collapsed and the world had not ended, and naming, it turned out, was not the curse the village had taught. Eligius Sanguine did not return to his coffin. He walked. He read. He sat in the throne room with Mara at his left hand, and listened more than he spoke. He treated her not as an ornament but as the other half of his decisions. Every writ went out under 2 seals, his and hers, and every petitioner addressed them both. He taught her slowly the old blood's languages, the names of the council's families, the politics of the mountain ranges, the small kindness of letting an enemy choose his own banishment. She taught him slowly the lower halls, what the kitchens needed, what the stables needed, what a girl with no roof learned to hear in a corridor. He listened. He was 312 years old, and he listened the way men of 20 have not yet learned to. At the end of that first year, on the anniversary of the night, Vasilia had pressed a candle into Mara's hand. The queen of the eastern range walked alone down the long, cold corridor to the chapel. The doors were still tall and still bound in iron, but they were unlocked now, and they were unguarded. She pushed them open herself. Inside the long, narrow room was the same vaulted ceiling, 6 tall windows of black glass, single raised dais at the far end. On the dais lay the coffin. It was still long and still made of iron, so black it ate the candlelight, and the gold runes across its lid no longer moved. They were quiet. They were finished. The coffin was empty. The king who had slept inside it for 47 years was awake somewhere above her, drinking tea with old Berta and asking her opinion on the new wage rolls. The chapel had been kept exactly as it was the night Mara had been sent into it, by Mara's order, as a memorial not to the king who had risen, but to the girl who had knelt with a rag and a candle, and a name she had not heard in 3 years. She walked the spiral she had once polished. She knelt. She put her hand on the cold black iron. She did not need to hear her name through it any more. She heard it now, every day in the throat of every steward and every cook and every stable boy and every king. She heard it in her own mouth when she said it back to herself in the dark. She heard it the way other people hear the bells of their village. She rose. She walked the rest of the spiral. She blew out the single candle by the door on her way out, and the chapel went into its long quiet, and the mountain, far above her, took a slow, soft breath of fog, and the keep settled into itself for another winter. She was sold to polish a coffin. He woke to call her by her name. The mountain remembers.